Hey guys, it's Multiplier with Sonic Academy looking at the oscillator modules in Circle 2. We're going to run through each one of the oscillators to see how it works and to understand what all those parameters mean, because there's not many of them, but some of them aren't that obvious when you first look at it. So the oscillators, these are the things that are generating our sounds. We have three different options. We have the analog oscillators, we have the wavetable oscillators, and then we also have the VPS oscillator, which is specific to Circle 2. So VPS it's the synthesis type that's specific to Circle 2, but it's not clear exactly from a science point of view exactly what it's doing. And to be honest, it's not too relevant. VPS does stand for vector phase shaping synthesis. And the way they somewhat described it is taking two sine waves and gluing them together. And then the way in which you quote unquote glue them together determines a vector. So I mean, it gets a bit complicated and they're really vague about exactly what it means. To be honest, it's not too relevant. The key thing with the VPS oscillator is understanding we have these two parameters, horizontal and vertical. Doesn't matter that they're called horizontal or one's called horizontal, one's called vertical. Instead, it's two parameters that we can play around with, and they're two parameters that in particular we can modulate. So as we hold down a note, so we can move these parameters around. And it creates interesting and new sounds that we haven't heard before. So that's all there is to VPS. It's purely a new oscillator with two parameters that generates cool sounds. In particular, bass sounds can sound pretty cool. So you can get some nice electro bass sounds. If you ever heard a track from Botneck, you'll hear this sort of sound. It's pretty cool stuff. And it's definitely a lot of fun. It's one of the things unique to Circle 2 is this particular type of sound. But remember, we do want to modulate these parameters. Modulation, as I've said before, is the key to synthesis, was one of the key ideas behind synthesizing great sounds. So we do want to modulate these parameters to get those interesting timbres. And then we have two other parameters in this VPS oscillator. They're two parameters, this coarse and fine parameter. They also exist in the other oscillators. So we can see here in analog, we have coarse and fine, and wavetable, coarse and fine. And what they are is they're ways of controlling or modulating or changing the pitch or the frequency of that particular oscillator. So we can see here, if we maybe reset by double clicking horizontal and vertical, we can move the coarse frequency or the note by a discrete number of semitones up and down, or we can have more fine control, which doesn't go as far. It's more of a way to detune a certain oscillator, or maybe if we want to have some vibrato, we could attach an LFO to it. It's that sort of thing. So it's fine control over the frequency or coarse, discrete control over the frequency. And this becomes especially useful when you have multiple oscillators. So if we turn on another oscillator, maybe also VPS just for fun, then what we can do is by changing, say, the fine or the detune amount of one oscillator, but leaving the top one where it is, then this will create that dissonance, because it'd be a bit pointless just to have one oscillator and then detune it slightly, because then it's just out of tune. But if you keep one in tune and then one slightly out of tune, it creates this cool sound. So you get that cool dissonance, which gives it a little bit of movement and thickens things up. Or what you could do, you can create a chord. So as you saw, as I drag this coarse down or up, it's a number of semitones. So now this orange VPS oscillator is going to be 7 semitones above the red one. So as I press a single note, it plays back a chord. So we can create chord structures without having to actually play a chord on the keyboard. And then one important detail that we're not going to cover in detail right now because it's quite an advanced concept, but notice there is a grey modulation source mapped to the coarse parameter. See here, there's a grey thing filled in. We don't want to mess with this at all, because what this is doing is it's allowing the keyboard to play different notes with this oscillator. So at the moment I can press any note on the keyboard and it means that this red oscillator will play back the right note. But if we in fact remove this grey modulation source, it doesn't matter what note I press on the keyboard, it will just play back whatever note this oscillator is set to. So it's not that useful. There are situations that we're going to cover later on where this is quite a nice synthesis idea. We want to do some more advanced things. But in most situations, we don't want to do that. So it's quite important we don't remove that modulation source. What that modulation source is in fact keyboard tracking or keyboard following. If we go to the keyboard section, it's this grey modulation source down here. We're going to cover this in a later video, so don't worry for now. For the time being, just note that we don't want to do what we just did, which is remove that modulation. So let's in fact turn off this red oscillator and go back to this orange one where it's already mapped. So if we have a look at the analog oscillator next, this is where we get our classic, our standard generic sounds. So we've got things like a sine wave, or a saw, or a square, or a triangle. Now these are definitely our simple sounds, they're the sounds you hear all the time, but Circle 2 is doing some cool processing behind the scenes to make sure they sound really great. That's why it's called an analog oscillator. It's not just called a simple oscillator, because it's doing some cool analog modeling and some cool processing. So if you do need something like a sawtooth wave, it's going to sound great if it comes out of Circle 2, whereas there are some synths where it doesn't sound too good. There are definitely some other synths that also have great saw sounds, for example. But a sawtooth isn't always a sawtooth. I mean, there's lots of different ways to process it behind the scenes. So even though these do look like simple wave types, they do sound great. You may have noticed a new button has appeared in this analog oscillator. We still have the coarse and the fine, but we have this sub button. We're going to cover that at the end of the video because it's quite an advanced concept that we don't use very often. So what we're going to do is instead have a look at the wavetable oscillator. Now, wavetable synthesis is something that chances are you've used at some stage in the past, because there's a VST synth called Massive made by Native Instruments. It's by far the most popular synth that's pretty much ever been made in the software world. And that basically uses wavetable synthesis, even though not everyone necessarily knows that that's what it's doing, because it doesn't give any visual feedback. One of the cool things about Circle 2 is how much visual feedback it gives. And this visual feedback allows us to understand exactly what a wavetable is and what it's doing when we modulate it. And we can see all this in this window on the left. So this window is displaying the cycle type or the subtable that we're playing at that given moment. So if I press a note on the keyboard that maybe corresponds to 1000 hertz, I mean that wasn't 1000 hertz, but let's just say it was, then it's playing this cycle through 1000 times a second. And then what we can do, we can actually determine what this cycle is in this window. So we have an option for the top, which will be a saw in this case. And we have an option for the bottom, which in this case is a triangle. And then the key thing is we have this wavetable position, or this wavetable position parameter, this thing over here. And as we move it up and down, it moves between these two things we've selected. So we selected sawtooth at the top. So as we drag this wavetable position to the top, it displays a saw sound and plays back a saw sound. And as we move it to the bottom, it moves into a classic triangle. Pretty cool, right? And then naturally all the points in between give all these middle positions. It's like blending the two sounds. But here's the really cool bit. What we want to do to create the most interesting sounds is we want to modulate this parameter. So we're moving between these different wave types. That's how you create those rich and harmonically interesting sounds. And we can choose different top and bottoms here. So we can choose, say, something quite a bit more complicated, maybe this one. And then maybe something a bit different at the bottom, maybe this one. And now, as we move through, it moves through a more interesting and complicated set of harmonics. Pretty cool, right? And that's basically what a wavetable is. It's a collection of subtables or a collection of cycles that we can move through, and it moves through in a nice way, and it sounds great when we modulate it. That's the key idea behind wavetable synthesis. We need to choose a cool wavetable, or in this case, create a cool wavetable, and then move through it by modulating it. And we can see to modulate it, we have these 3 holes over here. So for example, if we wanted to map an LFO to one of these, we go to the purple one, we'll set it to LFO. Again, we'll cover this in more detail in the modulation video, but we could drag it over here. And so now we know what each one of these oscillator types does and how it works, and you basically now know what the oscillators do. We can look at this sub button that I mentioned earlier. So what this sub button does, let's remove this modulation source to simplify things. And let's move the wavetable position to the bottom. What this sub button does is it slows down this oscillator, because right now, as I press a note, it's playing back this oscillator maybe 800 times a second or whatever other note I was pressing at that moment. Remember, hertz, which is a frequency, is physics for per second. So if you press a note and you read that as, say, 800 hertz, that means it's playing that cycle, or it's playing a sine wave 800 times a second. But if we hit this sub button, it will slow it right down. And what that allows us to do is use this oscillator actually as a low frequency oscillator. So just like we have this low frequency oscillator over here, which is doing a simple sine wave for its oscillation, for its modulation, anything we see as an oscillator here can be used as a modulation source. So it would basically do this cool wiggly shape as its modulation, but we need to hit it into sub mode to slow it right down. And then it's also worthwhile probably removing this keyboard following so we can have fine control over how this is doing its thing. So what will be the best way to demonstrate this? So we will have this orange wavetable doing the modulation. Let's set up this blue oscillator down here as an analog waveform. We'll turn it into a sawtooth. At the moment we're hearing this wavetable here, this orange oscillator coming through. So we'll turn that down in the mixer. So we're just hearing oscillator 4, see oscillator 4 coming through. And let's map this orange oscillator to, in fact, let's not have the analog, let's have this cool VPS oscillator. And we can map this orange oscillator to this horizontal position of this VPS. So to do that, we will drag this orange node to the horizontal. And now this wave type, whatever we have going on in this orange oscillator, is modulating this horizontal position. So because we've removed the keyboard following, it doesn't matter what note we press, this orange oscillator will play at a fixed speed. So if we want to slow it down, we can dial in the coarse and the fine parameters. How cool is that? So we've got a much more interesting LFO type. And then the cool thing here is because we can put any waveform we like in this oscillator slot, we can choose something more interesting or more crazy. So under Athens here, we could change it to a different wave type. Now, if we go too crazy, it all starts to fall apart. If we choose this one, doesn't really sound very good because it's happening a bit too fast and it's a bit too crazy. But we could choose something else, maybe this one. What might also be cool? This one maybe? Actually, this one's pretty cool. That's pretty cool, right? And that's what this sub button is used for. It's used to slow down this oscillator so we can use it as a modulation source. So that's quite an advanced thing we just did, but it's not too complicated really. All we did is essentially 2 main things, or I guess 3 things. So first of all, we slowed down this orange oscillator by kicking it into the sub mode, which slows it right down to a lot slower speed so we can use it as an LFO or a low frequency oscillator. We then crucially removed the keyboard follow modulation source so that it basically locked in this oscillator at a fixed speed. If we'd left that grey, in fact I can put it back to show you, if we put this grey modulation source back on here, then depending on what note we press on the keyboard, it would change the speed of this oscillator, which can be quite cool, but it can be quite hard to dial in if it's like that. See how that higher note is playing back faster? It's doing that modulation at a faster speed, whereas if I press a lower note, that's a result of this keyboard follow. We're going to cover keyboard follow in more detail in a later video, but for the time being, if you're not quite sure what keyboard tracking is or keyboard following, just remove that and understand that it's locking this oscillator to a fixed speed. And then once we did those two key steps, all we did after that is turn down oscillator 2 in the mixer, so none of this oscillator was going out to the master channel or into the filters or anything else. And then we set up the mapping or the routing for the modulation. So we dragged this orange node routing this oscillator to the horizontal position, or the parameter, changing the timbre of this oscillator here, this VPS guy. And there you go, that is how the oscillators work in Circle 2. We can either use them as simple sine wave, square wave, saw waves with maybe an analog oscillator, or do something a bit cool and different with VPS, or we can go super advanced and do some crazy wavetable synthesis stuff, or even use a wavetable oscillator as a modulation source. It's pretty cool stuff, I think. And yeah, in the next video, we're going to have a look at this middle column. So we're going to look at the filters and essentially modifying or shaping our source modules. I've been Multiplier, hope you enjoyed.